The stained glass window in the Market Church of Hamelin is gone now. It was installed around the year 1300. It showed a strange scene. A man in brightly colored clothes leads a group of children away from the town. For centuries, that window was the oldest evidence of a dark story. The story of the Pied Piper. The written record came later. In the town's chronicle, an entry for the year 1284 was added sometime in the mid-14th century. It's a simple, chilling note. It says that on June 26th, the day of Saints John and Paul, a piper dressed in many colors came to Hamelin. He played his pipe, and 130 children, all born in the town, followed him out. They went out the east gate towards a hill, and they were never seen again. This wasn't a fairy tale. Not at first. It was a town's memory of a catastrophe. The first accounts don't mention rats. That part was added 100 years later to give the story a reason. The core of the legend is not about pest control. It is about the sudden, inexplicable loss of 130 children. Historians have theories. Some think it was a plague that took the children. Some think it was a tragic accident, a landslide, or a drowning. But one of the most persistent theories is something called the Children's Crusade, or a similar movement. A charismatic leader, the Iper, may have recruited the town's youth for the German Eastern colonization effort. He promised them a new life in places like Pomerania or Transylvania. They left willingly, lured by promises of their own land and a better future. They walked out of town, and to their parents, they vanished from the world. They never came back. This is where fairy tales come from. They are not just fantasies. They are the decorative moss that grows over a sharp, hard stone of historical truth. They are the stories people told to explain the unexplainable, to process the horrors of their everyday lives. The world that created these stories was not a magical kingdom. It was a place of famine, disease, and constant, brutal uncertainty. The monsters in the woods were real, the cruel kings were real, the fear of starvation was real, and sometimes the children really did disappear. The stories were a way to remember, and a way to warn. They were a map of a world filled with real dangers, colored in with magic to make the truth bearable. Number 10, the wicked stepmother is not a myth. The story is familiar. A good and beautiful mother dies. A father, lonely or ambitious, remarries. The new wife, the stepmother, is jealous of the first wife's child. She is cruel. She favors her own children. She plots to get rid of the stepchild to secure the inheritance and the father's love for her own offspring. We see it in Snow White. We see it in Cinderella. The wicked stepmother is a cornerstone of fairy tale villainy. She is a cartoon of evil, a simple character for a simple story. But she wasn't a cartoon in the 14th century. She was a demographic and economic reality. Life was short. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. It was not unusual for a man to outlive 2 or 3 wives. When a landowner's wife died, leaving him with children, especially a daughter, he had to remarry. It was a practical necessity. He needed a woman to run the household, to manage the servants, and, most importantly, to give him more children, preferably a male heir. This created a tense and dangerous situation inside the home. The new wife, the stepmother, arrived in a precarious position. Her power and security depended entirely on her husband. Her primary duty was to produce an heir for him. If she had sons of her own, her entire focus would shift to securing their future. And often, a child from a previous marriage, a stepchild, was a direct obstacle to that future. Consider the case of Elizabeth de Burgh. She was born in 1332. Her father was William Don de Burgh, the 3rd Earl of Ulster, one of the most powerful Anglo-Irish lords. Her mother was Maud of Lancaster, a cousin to the King of England. Elizabeth was an immense heiress. She stood to inherit vast lands in Ireland and England. She was a prize. But in June 1333, when Elizabeth was just 1 year old, her father was murdered by his own cousins. Her world fell apart. Her widowed mother, Maud, fled to England with Elizabeth for safety. The vast de Burgh inheritance in Ireland was thrown into chaos. 5 years later, in 1338, Maud remarried. Her new husband was Sir Ralph de Ufford, a tough and ambitious knight who was appointed Justiciar of Ireland. He was tasked with restoring royal authority and, not coincidentally, securing his new stepdaughter's inheritance. For Maud, the marriage was a strategic move to protect her daughter's lands. But for Ralph, Elizabeth was a pawn in a much larger game of power and wealth. The situation grew more complex. Maud and Ralph had a daughter of their own, also named Maud. Now there were two daughters, Elizabeth, the heiress to the de Burgh fortune, and Maud, the daughter of the current man in charge. The potential for conflict was enormous. All of the new Maud's future prospects depended on what her parents could secure for her. Every acre of land that went to Elizabeth was an acre that couldn't go to her own daughter. Ralph de Ufford died in 1346. Elizabeth's mother, Maud, now twice a widow, withdrew from public life and became a nun. Elizabeth was left a ward of the English crown, a hugely wealthy orphan. Her marriage was a matter of state. In 1352, she was married to Lionel of Antwerp, the third son of King Edward III. This marriage brought the de Burgh inheritance directly into the English royal family. This story doesn't have a poisoned apple or a glass slipper, but it has all the real-world ingredients of the wicked stepmother trope. It has the death of a parent. It has the remarriage. It has the conflict over inheritance. The wickedness of a stepmother was often not about personal malice. It was about survival and ambition in a brutal system. A stepmother had a duty to her own children. In a world where land was wealth and wealth was power, a stepchild from a prior marriage was not a beloved family member. They were a rival claimant. The legal system recognized this tension. There were specific terms. The children of the first wife were the Bretwald, the rightful heirs. The children of the second wife were the afterling. The very language implied a hierarchy of importance. The stepmother's role was to elevate her afterlings. For a common family, the stakes were smaller but just as desperate. A peasant's cottage, a few strips of land, a cow. A new wife would worry constantly about her own children's survival if her husband died. Would the son from the first marriage get the land and turn them out? This fear could easily curdle into resentment and cruelty. The stepchild represented a constant threat to the meager security she had. The stories about evil stepmothers were not just meant to scare children. They were a reflection of a deep-seated social anxiety, a recognition of the fragile, often hostile structure of the medieval family. They were a warning about what could happen when a mother died and a stranger took her place. Number 9, the woods were not enchanted, they were deadly. In fairy tales, the forest is a place of transformation. It's where Hansel and Gretel find the gingerbread house, where Red Riding Hood meets the wolf, where Snow White finds the dwarves. The woods are a place of magic, danger, and mystery. They are a boundary between the known world of the village and the unknown world of adventure. The medieval reality was far grimmer. The forest was not a place of enchantment. It was a place of work, and it was a place of death. In the 13th and 14th centuries, much of Europe was still covered in vast, dense, unmanaged forests. These were not the manicured parks we know today. They were dark, tangled wildernesses. For a peasant living in a small village, the forest was a crucial resource. It provided wood for fuel and building. It was a place to forage for nuts, berries, and mushrooms. It was where they could graze their pigs on acorns. But it was also a place of immense danger. Getting lost was a real and terrifying possibility. There were few reliable paths, and landmarks were scarce and could be obscured by weather. A sudden fog or a heavy snowfall could disorient even an experienced woodsman. In 1321, the coroner's rolls for Bedfordshire, England, record the death of a man named William Paulet. He went into the woods of Millbrook to gather firewood. He never came back. His body was found weeks later. The official cause of death was misadventure. He simply got lost and died of exposure. This was a common story. There was no search party, no rescue service. If you got lost in the woods, you were on your own. The woods were also a place outside the law. Or rather, they were a place with their own very harsh laws. Large tracts of forest were often claimed by the king or a local lord as a personal hunting reserve. These were the king's forests. For the peasants living nearby, this meant a whole set of brutal restrictions. They were forbidden from clearing trees to create more farmland. They couldn't hunt deer or boar even if their families were starving. Poaching was not treated as simple theft. It was an offense against the king's property, and it was punished severely. A man caught hunting deer could be fined, imprisoned, or mutilated. The foresters who patrolled these lands were feared and hated figures, enforcing the Lord's will with absolute authority. This made the forest a natural haven for those who lived completely outside the law outlaws. Robbers and fugitives used the dense woods as a base of operations, and traveling along a road that passed through a forest was a risky business. The stories of Robin Hood have a romantic gloss, but the reality of forest bandits was terrifying. They would ambush travelers, rob them, and often kill them to prevent them from raising an alarm. The records of medieval courts are filled with cases of merchants and pilgrims being attacked on forest roads. Then there were the animals. While the danger of wolf attacks is its own specific trope, bears and wild boars were also a serious threat. A startled wild boar, with its sharp tusks, could easily kill a person. These were not fairy tale creatures, they were large, powerful animals defending their territory. So when a character in a fairy tale is sent into the woods or runs away into them, the medieval listener understood the stakes immediately. The woods were not a neutral space, they were a realm of chaos. To be in the woods was to be cut off from the community, from the protection of the village and the church. It was to be exposed to starvation, to the cold, to outlaws, and to wild beasts. The gingerbread house is a fantasy, a lure in the midst of this horror. It represents a false hope in a place where hope dies. The real terror of Hansel and Gretel isn't the witch. It's the moment their father leaves them in the dark, silent forest, a place from which, as he well knew, two small children were never meant to return. Number 8. The Big Bad Wolf was a real killer. The wolf in fairy tales is a cunning, talking villain. He can disguise himself as a grandmother. He can huff and puff and blow a house down. He is a character, a symbol of predatory danger. He is smart, and he can be outsmarted by a clever pig or a brave woodsman. In medieval Europe, the wolf was not a character. It was a constant, terrifying threat to life and livelihood. The wolves were widespread and numerous, and they were hungry. Their primary prey was wild game like deer, but as humans cleared more land for farming, that prey became scarcer. So wolves turned to an easier source of food livestock. For a peasant family, their livestock was their entire wealth. A cow provided milk and cheese. Sheep provided wool for clothing and meat. The loss of even a single animal to a wolf could be a devastating economic blow. The loss of a whole flock could mean starvation. Chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of wolf packs descending on villages and decimating their livestock. In France in the early 15th century, during the turmoil of the 100 Years' War, wolf populations boomed. With so many men away at war, there were fewer hunters to keep them in check. The countryside became overrun. The records from Paris in the 1420s and 1430s speak of wolves entering the city itself at night, scavenging for food, and attacking dogs. But the fear was not just for the animals. Wolves attacked people. This was not a rare occurrence. It was a regular feature of rural life. The most vulnerable were children, who were often tasked with watching the sheep or pigs in lonely pastures. A child was an easy target for a hungry wolf. Church records and local chronicles across Europe contain numerous, matter-of-fact accounts of children being killed and eaten by wolves. In 1439, the situation in the region around Paris had become so dire that the authorities organized a massive, systematic wolf hunt. The records detail the costs, the wages for the hunters, the price of the traps, the rewards paid for each wolf killed. This was not a sport. It was a public safety measure like dealing with a plague or a famine. The threat was that immediate. The fear of wolves was so profound that it seeped into the legal and social fabric of the time. Some villages employed a designated wolf catcher, the luparius, a specialized and respected profession. The lords were often expected to lead wolf hunts as part of their duty to protect their people. The fear also manifested in supernatural beliefs. An unusually bold or savage wolf was sometimes thought to be a werewolf, a loup-garou. The werewolf trials that took place in Europe were not just about superstition. They were an attempt to explain and to punish a very real terror. When a wolf was behaving in a way that seemed unnaturally aggressive, killing people with no fear, it was easier for a terrified community to believe it was a human in disguise than to accept that a normal animal could be so monstrous. The story of Peter Stump in the late 16th century comes after the medieval period, but it is a product of this long-standing fear. He was accused of being a werewolf and confessed to killing and eating numerous people. His trial was a spectacle of terror. The community needed a monster to blame for the very real deaths that had occurred. So when the big bad wolf comes to the door of the three little pigs or stalks Red Riding Hood in the forest, the story is tapping into a deep and ancient fear. The medieval audience didn't need to imagine the wolf's sharp teeth and powerful jaws. They knew them. They had seen what a wolf could do to a sheep or to a neighbor's child. The wolf of the fairy tales is a tamed version of the real thing. He can be boiled in a pot or cut open by a hunter. In the real medieval world, victory over the wolf was never so certain. He was the embodiment of the hungry, relentless wilderness that pressed in on all sides of a small, fragile village. Number 7. The starving children were not an exaggeration. The story of Hansel and Gretel begins with a stark and brutal problem poverty. There is a famine in the land. A woodcutter and his wife have no food left. They cannot feed their children. So, the stepmother proposes a solution. They will take the children deep into the forest and leave them there to die. The father objects, but he goes along with it. It is a horrifying choice, the kind of thing that only happens in a dark fairy tale, except it wasn't. The period from 1315 to 1317 saw one of the worst famines in European history. It is now known as the Great Famine. It began with rain. In the spring of 1315, it started to rain, and it didn't stop. It rained all through the summer and the autumn. Grain fields were flooded. Seeds rotted in the ground. The harvest was a catastrophic failure across northern Europe from Ireland to Poland. The next year, 1316, was no better. The rain continued. The meager stores of grain from the previous year were gone. There was no seed left to plant. What little did grow was stunted and diseased. The price of food skyrocketed. A bushel of wheat that cost 20 shillings in normal times now cost 120 shillings. People ate their draft animals, the oxen they needed to plow their fields. They ate their dogs and cats. They ate rats. The chronicles of the time, written by monks, paint a desperate picture. The English monk Johannes de Troclo wrote an account of the famine. He described the poor eating the bark from trees and the roots of plants in the forest. He wrote of people dying in the streets and in the fields, their bodies too numerous to be buried. The social order began to break down, and theft was rampant. People would do anything for a crust of bread. And then the stories began. Stories of the ultimate taboo. And Troclo and other chroniclers wrote that people were eating the dead. There were reports of men and women in prisons tearing apart and eating new inmates. And there were the darkest stories of all, the ones that sound like they come straight from a fairy tale. Stories of parents killing and eating their own children, of people luring children into their homes with the promise of food, only to kill them. We don't know how widespread these acts were. They were likely rare, desperate exceptions, but the fact that they were reported at all, and believed, shows the depth of the horror and despair. The psychological impact of the famine was immense. It was a world turned upside down, where the most basic bonds of family and community were shattered by hunger. So, when Hansel and Gretel's parents decide to abandon them in the woods, it is not a fanciful plot device. It was a choice that real people contemplated and that some may have even made. Leaving a child in the forest was a passive form of infanticide. It was a way to have one less mouth to feed without having to commit the act of killing directly. It was a desperate gamble, a hope that perhaps the child might be found by someone else or might somehow survive. But it was a death sentence. The witch in the gingerbread house is also a reflection of this reality. She is a figure who has food in a time of starvation. Her house is made of bread and cake, an impossible fantasy for a starving child. But her wealth comes at a terrible price. She is the personification of the rumors that circulated during the famine, the person who preys on the desperate, who hoards food, who might even be a cannibal. Hansel and Gretel, lured by the promise of food, walk straight into the trap that real medieval children were warned about. The story is a survival guide for a world where hunger could make monsters of your neighbors and even of your own parents. Number 6. The isolated tower was a real form of imprisonment. Rapunzel is locked away in a high tower with no doors and no stairs. It is a perfect fairy tale prison. Her isolation is absolute, designed by the witch Gothel to keep her hidden from the world. A similar trope appears in other stories where a princess is locked in a tower to protect her from a prophesied fate or an unwanted suitor. The tower is a symbol of forced confinement, a place of helpless waiting. This idea of being permanently walled away from the world was not just a fantasy. And in some cases, a voluntary practice in the medieval period. The practice was known as anchoritism. The person who chose this life was an anchorite for a man or an anchoress for a woman. An anchoress was a religious recluse. She would choose to be permanently enclosed in a small room or cell, usually built against the wall of a church. This was not a temporary retreat. It was a lifelong commitment. The ceremony to enclose an anchoress was similar to a funeral. The bishop would lead her to the cell, the office of the dead would be read, and she would be sealed inside. The door might be bricked up behind her. She was considered dead to the world. Her cell was small, perhaps only a few meters square. It would have 3 windows. One window, called a squint, opened into the church so she could hear mass and receive communion. A second window opened to the outside, but it was usually covered with a dark cloth and had a shutter, so no one could see in and she could not see out. This was how she received food and spoke to visitors who came seeking her spiritual guidance. A third window was for a servant who would tend to her basic needs. This was a life of extreme isolation and prayer. The anchoress was supposed to devote her entire existence to contemplation of God. Her confinement was a living martyrdom. It was seen as a holy and admirable act. Famous anchoresses like Julian of Norwich in the 14th century became respected spiritual authorities. People from commoners to nobles would come to her window to seek her advice and prayers, but the reality of this life must have been terrifying. It was a self-imposed prison sentence for life. The cell was small, dark, and probably cold and damp. The anchoress had no privacy. Her life was governed by a strict set of rules. She could never leave. Her only view of the world was a sliver of the church altar. While anchoritism was voluntary, the idea of permanent enclosure was also used as a punishment. Nuns who broke their vows could be sentenced to a similar kind of solitary confinement within their own convents. And for noblewomen, a form of this isolation could be imposed for political reasons. A noblewoman who was a political threat or whose marriage could shift alliances might be confined to a remote castle or a nunnery against her will. This wasn't a fairy tale tower with a prince waiting below. It was a real prison guarded by real soldiers. Her isolation was a way to neutralize her power by controlling who she could see, speak to, and marry. Her family or their rivals could control her lands and her influence. Eleanor of Brittany, born in 1184, lived this reality. She had a strong claim to the English throne, which made her a threat to her uncle, King John, and later her cousin, King Henry III. As a result, she spent nearly her entire life as a prisoner. From the age of about 18 until her death at 57, she was moved from one castle to another, Corfe, Bristol, Gloucester, always under guard. She was never allowed to marry. Her potential to produce a rival heir was too dangerous. Her confinement was not in a single, isolated tower, but the principle was the same. Her life was one of permanent enclosure, a political pawn locked away from the world. The fairy tale of Rapunzel, with her magical hair and a charming prince, puts a romantic spin on a very grim reality. And for women like Eleanor of Brittany, or even for the anchoress in her cell, the tower was not a temporary challenge to be overcome. It was a tomb in which they were buried alive. Number 5, the cruel noble was a terrifying neighbor. All fairy tales are full of wicked kings, cruel barons, and monstrous giants who live in castles and terrorize the surrounding countryside. They demand tribute, steal livestock, and act with absolute impunity. The giant in Jack and the Beanstalk is a classic example, a huge brutish figure who lives in a castle in the sky and eats Englishmen. These characters represent the fear of arbitrary, unaccountable power. In medieval Europe, this was not a fantasy. The feudal system was built on a hierarchy of power. At the top was the king, and below him were the great lords, barons, and knights. In theory, this system provided protection. The lord protected his people in exchange for their labor and loyalty. But when a lord was cruel, greedy, or unstable, the system became a nightmare for those living under him. There was often no one to appeal to. The Lord was the law. The life of Gilles de Rais, a 15th century French nobleman, is a historical example that is more horrifying than any fairy tale. He was born in 1404 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Brittany. He was intelligent, brave, and a skilled military commander. He fought alongside Joan of Arc and was made a Marshal of France at a young age. He was a national hero. But after the wars, He retired to his vast estates, including his favorite castle, Tafagus, and there his behavior became increasingly strange and depraved. He spent his fortune lavishly on theatrical productions, a huge personal retinue, and alchemical experiments trying to turn base metals into gold. As his debts mounted, his methods for acquiring money became more ruthless. He terrorized his neighbors, stole land, and extorted money from the local populace. The people in the region around his castles lived in constant fear. He was the local giant, the ogre in the castle on the hill. But his crimes were far worse than financial corruption. For years, peasants in the region had been reporting that their children were disappearing. They would be sent on an errand or go out to watch the sheep, and they would never be seen again. Suspicion eventually fell on Gilles de Rais and his household. The accusations were so serious that the Duke of Brittany and the Bishop of Nantes launched an investigation. In 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested and put on trial. The testimony was sickening. His own servants and associates described how he had lured children, mostly young boys, to his castles with promises of work or food. The trial records detail the fear he inspired. He was the most powerful man in the region. To speak out against him was to risk death. His castles were fortresses. What went on inside them was a secret. He was above the law, and he acted like it. The court found him guilty. He was executed in October 1440. The case of Gilles de Rais is an extreme one. But it illustrates the immense power that a local lord could wield. A lesser noble might not be a monstrous killer, but he could still be a tyrant. He could raise taxes at will, demand unpaid labor, seize crops, and dispense brutal, arbitrary justice in his own court. A peasant had virtually no recourse against a cruel lord. The stories of ogres and giants were a way for common people to talk about this reality. The monster in the castle was a stand-in for the feared baron down the road. The giant's fee-fo-fum and his desire to grind bones to make his bread were a grim metaphor for the lord's power to consume the lives and labor of the people who lived on his land. The fairy tale provided a safe way to express this fear. And in the fairy tale, unlike in real life, the giant could sometimes be defeated by a clever, brave boy with a handful of beans. Number 4, witches and curses were a part of the justice system. The witch is a staple of fairy tales. She is usually an old, ugly woman who lives on the edge of the village. She has magical powers, which she uses for evil. She casts curses, brews potions, and makes pacts with dark forces. She is the source of unexplained misfortune. If the cow stopped giving milk, or a child falls ill, the witch is to blame. This belief was not just a story. In the medieval period, the fear of witchcraft or maleficium wrongdoing was real and deeply ingrained in the culture. People believed that it was possible for certain individuals to use supernatural means to harm others. This wasn't just a folk belief, it was a matter for the courts. One of the earliest and most famous witch trials in Europe was that of Dame Alice Keiteler, which took place in Kilkenny, Ireland in 1324. The story has all the elements of a dark fairy tale. Alice Keiteler was a wealthy and powerful woman. She was not a poor old crone. She was an aristocrat, the daughter of a Flemish banker. She had been married 4 times, and each of her husbands had been rich and powerful. And each of them had died, leaving her wealthier than before. With each marriage, she grew her fortune and influence, maneuvering to ensure that her own son from her first marriage, William Outlaw, would inherit the bulk of her combined wealth. This made her a target. The children of her later husbands, her stepchildren, were resentful. They saw their inheritances being diverted to Alice and her son. They began to whisper, "How could one woman be so lucky in business and so unlucky in husbands?" Rumors started to circulate that she was using magic to achieve her ends. The accusations were brought to the attention of the local bishop, Richard de la Drede. He was a zealous and ambitious man, determined to root out heresy in his diocese. He saw the case of Alice Keiteler as a major opportunity. He formally accused Alice, her son William, and several of her associates of a range of heretical and magical crimes. The charges laid out by the bishop read like a witch's charter from a fairy tale. Alice was accused of denying Christ. She was accused of making sacrifices to a demon named Robin, son of Art, to whom she offered red cocks and the eyes of peacocks. She was accused of brewing magical potions in the skull of a decapitated robber using herbs, worms, and the clothes of unbaptized baby boys. And most significantly, she was accused of using sorcery to bewitch and kill her husbands and to magically transfer all their wealth to her own son. This was not just a family squabble over money anymore. It was a formal trial for heresy and witchcraft. Alice, however, was a powerful woman with powerful connections. She fought back. She used her influence to have the bishop arrested and imprisoned for a time. But Laedredi was relentless. He eventually got the upper hand. He interrogated Alice's servants. One of them, a woman named Petronilla de Meath, was questioned intensely. Under duress, Petronilla confessed to everything her accusers wanted to hear. She became the first person in Ireland to be burned at the stake for heresy. But Alice Kyteler, the main target, was too clever. Before she could be sentenced, she used her wealth and connections to escape. She fled Ireland and was never seen again. Her son, William, was convicted of lesser charges. He was ordered to pay for a new roof for the cathedral and to attend 3 masses every day. The case of Alice Kyteler shows how the fairy tale image of the witch was built on real-world fears and social tensions. The accusations against her were a mixture of inheritance disputes, political power struggles, and genuine belief in the power of magic. A curse was not just a magical word in a story, it was a criminal accusation. It was a way to explain death, to attack a rival, and to seize their property. For people like Petronilla de Meath, the fairy tale witch was not a fantasy. She was a legal category, an accusation that could and did lead to a terrifying death. Number 3, the changeling explained a parent's worst fear. In European folklore, there is a dark and persistent story about fairies. They are not the tiny, glittering sprites of modern cartoons. They are a powerful, mysterious, and often dangerous race of beings who live in a world parallel to our own. And one of the most terrifying things they were known to do was to steal human babies. The story of the changeling goes like this. The fairies would sneak into a human home and take away a healthy, beautiful baby. In its place, they would leave one of their own, a changeling. This creature looked like the human baby, but it was not. It was often sickly, deformed, or had a voracious, insatiable appetite. It might be developmentally delayed, unable to walk or talk at the proper age. It would cry incessantly and bring nothing but misery to the family that was forced to care for it. This belief was incredibly widespread and lasted for centuries. It was a way for people in a pre-scientific age to explain a range of tragic childhood conditions. In a time of high infant mortality, a baby that was failing to thrive was a source of immense anxiety. A child born with a physical disability, a congenital disorder like Down syndrome, or a neurological condition like autism was a complete mystery. There was no medical explanation. The changeling story provided one. It was not your child that was sick or different. Your real child had been stolen by the fairies. This creature in the cradle was an impostor, a piece of enchanted wood, or a wizened old fairy. This belief served a psychological purpose. It distanced the parents from the difficult reality of their child's condition. It was easier to believe your baby was a magical monster than to accept that he or she was simply ill or disabled. The folklore is full of grim cures for this problem. These were rituals designed to shock or trick the changeling into revealing its true nature and to force the fairies to return the stolen human child. One common method was to threaten the changeling with fire or iron. The parents might heat a shovel in the fire and pretend they were going to throw the child onto it or hold the child over the hearth. The belief was that the fairy creature, fearing for its life, would then vanish, and the real child would be returned. Other methods were more bizarre. The 12th century writer Gerald of Wales recorded a story about a woman who was advised to brew beer in an eggshell. The changeling in her cradle saw this and exclaimed, "I have seen the acorn before the oak. I have seen the egg before the white chicken, but I have never seen a brewer of beer in an eggshell." This speech, coming from what was supposed to be an infant, exposed it as an ancient fairy creature, and it vanished. These stories sound like strange fantasies, but it is chillingly clear that these rituals were sometimes actually carried out. Our court records and church documents from the medieval and early modern periods contain accounts of parents being prosecuted for harming or killing their own children in an attempt to get rid of a suspected changeling. A child who was sick, disabled, or simply difficult was at real risk. The belief in changelings gave a supernatural justification for neglect and violence. The German religious reformer Martin Luther in the 16th century spoke about this belief. He was asked what should be done with a child who was believed to be a changeling. He declared that it was not a real child, but a mass of flesh inhabited by the devil, and that it should be drowned. His view was extreme, but it shows how deeply this belief was held, even by educated and powerful figures. The changeling trope in fairy tales is a reflection of this profound fear. It is the story of a parent's love being tested by a child who is not what they expected. It is a story about the terror of the unknown, about the struggle to understand disease and disability in a world without medicine. It is the dark side of the cradle, a folk explanation for a pain that was all too real. Number 2, the poisoned apple was a weapon of the rich. The poisoned apple in the story of Snow White is an iconic fairy tale weapon. It is beautiful on the outside, red and tempting, but deadly on the inside. It is a trick of betrayal, is a weapon that requires no strength, only cunning. The evil queen uses it because it is a quiet, subtle way to kill her rival. This method of murder, a poison, was not a fantasy. It was a real and feared tool of intrigue, especially among the wealthy and powerful. In the corridors of medieval and Renaissance courts, where power struggles were constant and succession was often a matter of life and death, poison was known as the weapon of women or the weapon of cowards. But it was also the weapon of the patient and the politically astute. Unlike a sword or a dagger, poison left little immediate evidence. A sudden illness, a wasting disease, these were common occurrences in an age of primitive medicine. A well-chosen poison could mimic the symptoms of a natural sickness, allowing the murderer to escape suspicion. This made it the perfect tool for eliminating a political rival, a troublesome spouse, or a monarch who stood in the way of your ambition. The fear of being poisoned was a constant anxiety for any person of high rank. Kings and popes employed official food tasters. Their job was to eat a small portion of every dish before it was served to their master, a dangerous but essential role. Certain precious materials, like a piece of a unicorn's horn, actually a narwhal's tusk, or a type of stone called a bezoar, a hard mass from an animal's stomach, were believed to have the power to detect or neutralize poison. A king might dip his unicorn horn into his wine goblet before drinking. These were the security systems of their day. Knowledge of poisons was a specialized and secret art. It was part of the study of herbalism and alchemy. Certain plants were well known for their deadly properties: nightshade, hemlock, monkshood, also called wolfsbane. But the most famous and feared poison of the age was arsenic. It was a white crystalline powder that was odorless and tasteless, making it easy to mix into food or drink. In small, repeated doses, it could produce a long, slow illness that looked like a natural disease. It became known as the inheritance powder because it was so often used in disputes over wealth and property. The city-states of Italy in the late medieval and Renaissance periods were notorious centers of poisoning. Families like the Borgias became legendary for their supposed use of poison to dispatch their enemies. While many of the stories about them are exaggerated, the fear they inspired was genuine. Lucrezia Borgia was rumored to have a hollow ring she used to slip poison into drinks. Her brother Cesare Borgia was said to have a favorite poison called Cantarella, a secret recipe based on arsenic. A specific documented case from an earlier period is the death of Engelbert II, the Archbishop of Cologne, in 1225. He was one of the most powerful men in the Holy Roman Empire. He was ambushed and killed by a group of knights led by his own cousin, Frederick of Eisenberg. But the initial plot, according to some chronicles, was to poison him. The conspirators tried to bribe his cook and his cupbearer to administer the poison. The plan failed when the servants refused, forcing the assassins to resort to open violence. The story shows that even in a world of swords and armor, poison was often the first choice for a political assassination. The evil queen in Snow White, a royal figure consumed by jealousy, acts exactly like a real medieval court intriguer. That she doesn't challenge Snow White to a duel. She resorts to stealth and deception. The poisoned comb, the suffocating bodice, and finally the poisoned apple. These are the tools of a poisoner. The fairy tale distills the paranoia of a royal court into a single potent image, a beautiful piece of fruit that carries a hidden death. It was a warning that the greatest dangers often come in the most tempting disguises. Number 1, giants and ogres were the folk memory of invaders. The giant is a creature of immense size and terrifying strength. In fairy tales, he lives in a castle or a cave, often on a mountain or across the sea. He is a primal force of destruction. He raids human settlements, steals cattle, and sometimes he eats people. He is the ultimate wither, a monster defined by his non-human scale and his brutal appetite. The ogre is his close cousin, often more cunning but just as malevolent. This fear of giant man-eating marauders was not born in a vacuum. It was, in many ways, a folk memory of real historical invasions that had terrorized Europe for centuries. To a peasant living in a small, isolated village, a band of foreign raiders would have seemed like monsters. They were often physically larger, spoke a strange language, and acted with a brutality that was outside the norms of local society. Consider the Viking raids that began in the late 8th century. For the monks of the Lindisfarne Monastery in England, the arrival of the Norsemen in 793 must have felt like the apocalypse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with horror. The harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. These raiders came from the sea in their longships. To the English villagers, they came from an unknown, almost mythical world. They were, on average, physically larger than the Anglo-Saxon population at the time, a difference due to better nutrition. They were armed with terrifying axes and swords, they were pagan, and they had no respect for Christian churches or relics. They sacked monasteries, killed the monks, and carried off treasure and slaves. They were, in effect, giants coming from across the water to plunder and destroy. The stories of their raids passed down through generations would have grown in the telling. The size of the raiders would be exaggerated. Their cruelty would become legendary. The memory of a historical event would slowly transform into a myth about monsters. The Viking raider, with his horned helmet, a later invention, but a powerful image, his great axe, and his lust for gold, is a clear ancestor of the fairy tale giant with his club and his chest of stolen treasure. Centuries later, Europe faced another terrifying wave of invasions from the east, the Mongols. In the 13th century, Mongol armies swept across Russia, Poland, and Hungary. Their military tactics were unlike anything Europeans had seen. Their speed, discipline, and sheer ferocity were devastating. They were expert horsemen and archers, and they practiced a form of psychological warfare, often wiping out entire city populations to encourage others to surrender without a fight. To the Europeans who faced them, the Mongols seemed alien and monstrous. Chronicles of the time describe them in subhuman terms. They were short, stocky, with strange, broad faces. Rumors circulated that they were cannibals. Matthew Paris, a 13th century English monk and chronicler, wrote of them as a detestable nation of Satan who were inhuman and like beasts. He recorded stories of them eating their captives and drinking the blood of their horses. This is the language used to describe ogres, not enemy soldiers. The very word ogre is believed to have its roots in this historical trauma. It likely comes from the Latin word orcus, a name for the Roman god of the underworld, but it came into popular use in stories and was often associated with invaders from the east, like the Hungarians or Magyars, who were also known as Hongres. The fear of these invading hordes, who seemed to come from the ends of the earth and who destroyed everything in their path, became codified in the figure of the cannibalistic ogre. When a fairy tale tells of a giant or an ogre who lives in a distant land and comes to raid the human world, it is echoing the very real historical experience of countless European villages. It is the story of Lindisfarne. It is the story of the Mongol invasion of Hungary. The fairy tale monster is a way of processing the memory of an enemy who seemed larger than life, whose cruelty was incomprehensible, and whose arrival meant that the world as you knew it was about to be torn apart.